NC Impact is made possible by funding from Civic Federal Credit Union. NC Impact is a production of UNC TV Public Media North Carolina in association with the University of North Carolina School of Government.
People wanted to still preserve the past, but look to the future and how we could blend that together.
Some rural communities are still reeling because their main industries left town. How one community is using historic preservation to revitalize their economy. This is NC Impact. I'm Anita Brown-Graham. Welcome to NC Impact. This week, we're looking at how preserving our local history can be one way to revitalize a community. Joining us are Ramona Bartos of the North Carolina Department of Natural and Cultural Resources, State Senator Ted Alexander, who also serves as Western Region Director for Preservation North Carolina, and April Johnson, Executive Director of Preservation Durham. Before we go to our terrific expert panelists, let's visit with a Rocky Mount business owner who struggled to find an attractive space for her business downtown. We'll learn how she ended up in a place she never expected. NC Impact's David Hurst reports.
Like up front and then down through the center are gallery artists.
When Jessica Hicks first moved to Rocky Mount, she says she saw a dying downtown and not many opportunities for her business.
We looked at buildings downtown. Most of them were dilapidated, but you paid a lot of money for it. But then you had to do a lot of renovation to it as well, up to, I don't know, $500,000. Just thinking ahead of time.
Hicks and her husband then came across an old Chevrolet dealership. It would take some work to renovate, but they saw the potential.
Well, she actually won a contest.
Hicks saw it as an opportunity to blend her modern style with some Rocky Mount history, and they eventually opened an art center and yoga studio in the space.
We believe that when a town is growing, the art center needs to be implemented, not just the art center, but yoga as well, because of the beliefs and the concepts. It's just very pure and beautiful. We believe that needs to happen from the ground up and not when the city is already developed. I mean, I've even battled with
Hicks and her husband updated the space but preserved some of the history of the dealership, including using an old garage door as the partition between the art center and yoga studio. Stories like this are what city leaders had in mind when they decided to make it a priority to invest in historic preservation in an effort to revitalize the downtown.
People wanted to still preserve the past, but look to the future and how we could blend that together. Had that not happened, then I think the deterioration of the downtown would have continued.
Rochelle Small-Toney says at one point they struggled to attract and retain younger people to the area. Now they're using their history as a unique selling point to lure businesses and people to Rocky Mount.
But since those investments have been made, now we're starting to see even more interest in the downtown, particularly people who now want to live in the downtown area.
That's what keeps it interesting.
For Jessica Hicks, her business is doing well, and she's glad to call Rocky Mount home. She's hopeful others will soon join her and share her vision of seeing the potential of a growing historic community.
But I just really wanted to bring people downtown and show them that there's nothing to be afraid of and that these old buildings are amazing and you don't need to build something new. You can just use what you have.
Senator Alexander, let's start with you, if we might. These projects can be a really big deal for small towns. Rocky Mount was historically a mill town, one of many in North Carolina, hurt by the closure of textile factories and mills during the 20th century. Talk to us a little bit about what are some of the challenges for communities as they've worked to revitalize their economy?
Certainly, I grew up in Morganton, which was a furniture town, and have lived in Shelby for the last 30-some years, which was a textile town. So I have seen firsthand how the manufacturing, particularly after NAFTA, but particularly around the years early 2000s, that these factories closed, and fairly rapidly in many cases. And what you were left with was some pretty huge infrastructure, very large mills, vacant mills, and also the resulting neighborhoods that were in the vicinity, the mill villages. So what you have is you would have these very, very big pockets of vacancies and deterioration and so forth in these communities. And so the challenge is for those communities is how can they take these, what might otherwise be seen as a liability, and turn them into an asset. And preservation, historic preservation, can come and play a huge role, I think, and I have seen in being able to revitalize these communities through the revitalization of these vacant mills and mill villages and so forth. So there is a great opportunity to take a liability and turn it into an asset.
And here we're not just talking about creating physical assets, we're really talking about creating community. So Ramona, we heard in the story this need in Rocky Mount, this desire to make it a place that young people wanted to live, work. The median age in rural communities is 43 years old. That's 7 years older than urban centers. Well, what are some of the difficulties in attracting and retaining younger people to these communities? And how does historic preservation help?
Well, I can completely relate to your question. I come from a rural background, a small town, and actually returned there, unlike many of my peers, to have a business for some time before I entered state service. But I think one of the biggest challenges amongst individuals, and it's sort of a perception, if you will, a preconceived notion, is that life is, quote, somewhere else. The jobs are there too. And I need to leave here, being the small town, the rural town, to embrace that. But in fact, all the things that you left behind in your small town, the walkable downtowns, a reasonable commute, that tight-knit community, sometimes you find that with great difficulty in a more urban setting, a metro setting, and you probably will pay a premium for all of those things that you could have at a much more affordable cost with authentic North Carolina historic buildings that are unique unto themselves. And I would say whether you're trying to look for a residence for yourself and your family in that town, or you're looking for an investment opportunity in a historic building, I think you're going to find that affordability factor will help a great deal, particularly if you're running a business and your margins will work better with your debt service, I think. So, and I want to point out too that historic preservation is not just a metro phenomenon, it's very much a rural phenomenon in North Carolina. 91 of our 100 North Carolina counties have had at least one historic tax credit project, and in many cases, multiple ones. So I think there's a bright future to combine people's lifestyles and their life choices with where they want to settle, and North Carolina's small towns are waiting.
Love it. April, you're in Durham. Every community in North Carolina has had some economic struggle as a result of COVID-19. But what advice would you give to these rural communities Ramona just spoke of in terms of how they keep going in historic preservation, notwithstanding the economic headwinds of COVID-19?
I think the advice I would give is similar to what Ted and Ramona mentioned before. It's this concept of you have acres of diamonds in your backyard. And so your community is a treasure. And it's sometimes it's like a treasure hunt. Find that treasure within your community. Preservation is still important during this time because buildings tell stories. And during this really interesting social time that we're going through, with a lot of social unrest, with injustices being made abundantly clear, buildings embody those stories. This is an opportunity for healing. The buildings can be used as a place of healing, but also as a place of understanding. So I think that these buildings preservation can build curiosity within us.
Thank you. That's a great answer. We saw in our first story one example of Rocky Mount's effort to use their history as a way to attract businesses. NC Impact's David Hurst looks at what's possible when a community buys into the idea of historic preservation.
It surprised me what people like.
When Javelin Guilford opened his floral shop in downtown Rocky Mount 3 years ago, there wasn't much going on downtown.
We had, a couple of beauty shops down here, but we didn't have no main foot traffic. So when I first settled here, it was kind of a struggle to get business up and running.
But as his business grew, so did the downtown.
I just added a few more flowers to cover up in those spots.
Oh, that's...
Guilford says more business owners are moving downtown as they see the potential that it can soon again be a thriving, vibrant district, just like it was in the 60s and 70s.
It was a hustle and bustle, downtown. Everybody went downtown on a Saturday, or either we went for movie theater or shopping or just to hang out.
So we carry about 200 different labels.
For Sarah Hicks, she moved to Rocky Mount to open a wine shop and play a role in bringing downtown Rocky Mount's history back to life.
Everything older is better. I think there was just a lot more craftsmanship back in, when things were built in the 1910, 1920s, and you have to preserve that.
City leaders say downtown revitalization is often all about momentum. As soon as a few entrepreneurs became interested in joining the revitalization downtown, many others followed.
They see the beauty, the architectural beauty of these buildings, and they know what the land cost was in the Triangle versus what it is here, and they're really excited. And their energy creates energy. It creates excitement within our community for our local citizens. So we're just really excited about what's going on now.
Yeah, I'm gonna vase so I can...
For Guilford, he's excited to be part of the movement that is preserving history while creating a more vibrant future.
Most people are starting their business downtown so that they could bring downtown back to life.
April, the first question goes to you. We are going to be throwing around lots of fancy words here, and we'll be talking a little bit about adaptive reuse. What do those words mean, and why are they important?
Well, Anita, adaptive reuse is taking an existing building and giving it a use other than its original use. So adaptive reuse is important because, first of all, we instead of new construction, we protect our environment and reduce our carbon footprint by using an existing building. Secondly, it's a way to revitalize the local economy. So now a building that may have been vacant for maybe 10, 20 plus years is now providing income to the tax base. Also, it's helping to build wealth because now there's a business owner involved and there are also employees. So it's providing for families. So that's the economic development piece. But also there's this community aspect. Now the building is being used, it's been patronized for whatever goods and services it provides. It becomes a site of interest. Usually they have architectural details that help beautify or have some great aesthetic to the neighborhood. And it adds that piece. So it becomes a place of interest and attraction, and a place where people now connect. And also, going back to my theme of building curiosity in our buildings, historic buildings, people begin to learn about the building's story and the story of the community, and this can be shared amongst the community.
Let me turn now to you, Ted, because these projects are not always easy to do. So as you're talking to community leaders, why do you tell them it's important for them to focus on adaptive reuse projects rather than just go forward with building new construction?
Couple things. I mean, I kind of hate waste, so I see it as conservation. I see it as you're conserving things that are already in place. You're not having to go out and run new water lines, new sewer lines to an area for a very large cost when you've got that infrastructure already in place for the most part. And it really is a part of taking advantage of the assets that you have. Somebody mentioned you take what it gives you. Preservation is like jujitsu. You take what it gives you and you work with it and you make it work for you. And if you I would say that it's important not only for the intangibles, but because it can make economic sense. Now, it is tough. Some of these projects are expensive and they are a challenge, and it takes a hardy soul sometimes to have the vision to take a building that is otherwise in pretty bad condition and see how this can be something of beauty again. It was once a beauty, and now it can be a beautiful again. But it's important to see that this tells you how you view your community.
My final question for this segment before we go to another Rocky Mountain story is it can't be that if you build it, they will come. So what are the features that make these adaptive reuse projects successful?
I think one of them is the individuals who own and invest in these properties. They have a vision for the property. They want to see it return to the community and have a role in the community, especially when it was completely abandoned or terribly underutilized. Also having that great business plan, and you don't enter into these things lightly, especially if you take on a large mill project, for example. You've got to have the idea of what's the program for the building and how will that building sync in, if you will, with the other assets of the community. And the partnerships aspect of these properties is really important to, again, some of the biggest cheerleaders you'll hear from are the Main Street program, are your Chamber of Commerce, and so forth. So making sure that there's all of those items in place, I think, is really important. But also, I think sometimes you build it, people do come because they want to experience the building. They want to know those stories that April so wonderfully elaborated on. And furthermore, I think they want to make that building part of their own personal experience, their own memory, the memory making for themselves. And I think that's very satisfying to me, I have to say.
So as we've seen, Rocky Mount has multiple adaptive reuse projects. Next, we'll visit the Rocky Mountain Mills, where an abandoned cotton mill has been turned into a place to work, to live, and to play.
Directly adjacent to us over there, we have our taproom space.
After 6 years in the corporate world, Cameron Schultz had an opportunity to open his own brewery.
Started business planning and looking for the perfect place to start my business. And long story short, I found Rocky Mountain Mills and the facilities here, and this is where I decided to go for it.
Hopfly opened in 2017 at Rocky Mountain Mills. It's the site of what's believed to be the second oldest cotton mill in North Carolina. The mill halted production in 1996 and sat abandoned for several years until Capitol Broadcasting Company bought the land. They had plans to redevelop it, just like they had with the American Tobacco Historic District in Durham.
When I first came out here, it was dirt and the buildings weren't renovated. There was nothing, but you could see the vision and see where they wanted to take it. And seeing the success they've had elsewhere, it was something I wanted to be a part of.
With a river patio.
Evan Covington Chavez is the development manager for Rocky Mountain Mills. She says their focus was adapting the unique architecture of the mill to the modern needs of small businesses.
That was one of the really big moments for Rocky Mountain in terms of sort of impacting the economy. So for us to be able to be part of bringing that back and starting that history again, and having people be proud again of this space was pretty important. So the Skylight Suites are upstairs and downstairs, you can see.
Covington Chavez says that in the beginning, they were expecting larger tenants to move in, but when that didn't happen, they found other opportunities to grow.
So then we decided we had to sort of build the market ourselves, and figuring out what that market was probably our first big obstacle. And we landed on the idea of an incubator and then went from the incubator to the brewery incubator just because craft brewing was sort of taking off.
What's up, dude?
For Schultz, it served as the perfect market to grow his business. And it's also become his home, as he's now walking distance to where he works.
There aren't that many places outside of a really big city where you're able to do that. And doing it right here on the banks of the Tar River is a beautiful, beautiful spot to live this life.
Senator Alexander, assuming that the community can identify these physical assets, let's talk about the money for a minute. What kinds of public incentives are available for those looking to invest in adaptive reuse projects?
Well, a lot of these projects that Ramona alluded to, the schools, the mills, the hospitals, those are large projects. And it does take quite a bit of planning and a lot of different kinds of incentives sometimes to be brought to bear in order to make these economically and financially sound. So what happens is most developers or most people who are going to look at those projects have to kind of cobble together almost a variety of different incentives that are out there, and you're trying to make those apply to your particular project. Couple of examples. Of course, the most notable one is the historic tax credits that are available for either the state or federal, and for commercial or in some cases in the state would be the home ownership tax credits. But that's a major one that's out there, but it's not always the only one that's out there. People should look at the fact that there are sometimes local incentives, like in downtowns. The Main Street program may have some local incentives. There is also, related to some of these projects, possibility of using brownfield agreements. There are new market tax credits that are out there for various projects. There are now opportunity zones that may provide some sort of incentives for some of these developments. And then the affordable housing tax credits that are available through the North Carolina Housing Finance Agency.
And if I could offer, I'm sorry, Senator.
Oh, that's okay. Go ahead.
I was just going to offer one more, but it's a local one as well, which is properties that are locally landmarked, which is a process that happens through that community's preservation commission or landmarks commission, can be extended a 50% property tax deferral, which can be a very attractive aspect as well.
Exactly. And then there are times when it makes sense, and we've seen this in some of the larger towns especially, but it could apply in a smaller town. There are opportunities for easement donations, preservation easement donations to a group like Preservation North Carolina or some other group, where the donation of that easement, that preservation easement, has monetary value, and that can be counted as a tax deduction for your project, which again, you cobble all of these together in order to make a financially feasible project.
How do we get the community to understand the importance of African American heritage related to a structure, building, culture, such as the YMI Cultural Center in Asheville? And this is coming, of course, from Asheville. Ramona, you want to take that?
Sure. I was going to say the National Register, the process by which you nominate things to the National Register at the state level, then it goes to the federal government. Like I said, it's an honorific, but it's also a history report. It's also it's a recognition of that building's history. There's a lot of research that goes into that, from oral histories to reported history to newspapers to Sanborn maps. So the National Register is a starting place. It's also a culmination of that. But I want to look to my colleague April, who works in a community very closely with individual constituents and communities, because there's more than just the National Register. There's all manner of other activities, and in my mind, getting oral histories to me is terribly important, because that's irreplaceable. But I think April would have a lot of more some additional thought about all of that.
Well, absolutely, Ramona. It can be difficult for African American communities. Number one is that our communities don't always meet the basic eligibility to be on the National Register. And it's heartbreaking, because these communities want the recognition that their neighborhood, their community is historic, and it's special. And the reason being is that the architectural integrity is no longer there. So what do? We create a different way of telling the story. So whether it's community talks, like we do sometimes over there in the Stokesdale district or near NCCU, the library, the historic Black library there sometimes have talks about the history of certain people in the neighborhood or the neighborhood in general, or organizations like Preservation Durham organizing a talk where we discuss these things, or folks can visit our website at Open Durham and begin to put and input stories related to a building and photos if they have them. So there are other ways to engage and to have these conversations. I like markers. Historic markers is a way. It's not everything, but it's a way to bring recognition that there's a story here and to start a conversation. Creative websites where people can go and visit. Books, there are other ways to do it, but yeah, sometimes it is a struggle to get the message across and the story across. We also have walking tours of our downtown, focusing on civil rights history and Black Wall Street in Durham, which we still do during the pandemic, but in smaller groups. So there are other ways to tell our story.
Thank you. I want to say thank you to these three outstanding panelists. I've learned a lot and it's been a lot of fun. I also want to say thank you to you for watching and engaging. There are solutions available to us if we work together. Tell us what your community is doing or how we can help you. Email us at ncimpact@unc.edu or message us on Twitter or Facebook. And you can always join the conversation on Facebook Live. Coming up on NC Impact. In the wake of protests across the country, how one North Carolina city is building trust between the police and the community.
NC Impact is made possible by funding from Civic Federal Credit Union. NC Impact is a production of UNC TV in association with the University of North Carolina School of Government.